So after 40k's big new balance pass, which armies seem to have won and lost the most? Let's talk through the armies, how they seem to be doing for in-game power before, and how the changes might affect them going forwards. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the big changes from the September balance update, after the dust has settled just a little bit from Games Workshop's big reveals on Friday night, going through again in terms of faction strength and balance. In 40k's latest balance pass, there were really quite a lot of points updates, including the Imperial Knights getting their post-codex points and Ethon Shan getting his. The balance data slate made plenty of rules changes to various units out there, and a few nerfs for detachments that seemed rather stand out. There were several faction-specific FAQs for the latest wave of codexes, and that big update to the Tournament Companion banning Challenger cards, which I might talk about a bit more in the next video. There still might well be more to come. They've usually been doing new detachments when they've done these balance passes, so it seems like there's a pretty reasonable chance that they'll turn up in the not too distant future. Plus some new kill team related datasheets, which could be quite a big deal for Deathwatch in particular. For this one I thought we'd go through each faction in the game, roughly how well they seem to have been performing for in-game strength, and for this one I'll look at tournament win rates and sort of a top level event performance with how many tournament victories they've got, what changed in terms of the balance changes, what seems most meaningful to actually make the faction stronger or weaker overall, and whether overall the faction seems to have won, lost or stayed the same power-wise. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up we had the Adeptus Astartes. The standard Space Marines have kind of low tournament win rates, 44% or so, though I feel like Space Marines in particular have big gulfs between their strongest and more average lists, and lots of players sticking to their own locked-in chapters, as opposed to just running Ultramarines, which seems to have been the way to go at least prior to the balance pass. For actual tournament victories, they haven't really had too many of them, only 5, which is pretty low for a pretty popular faction with lots of players. Obviously they can win with a good army in the right hands played well, but they certainly don't seem stand out in top level success. Lists for them tended to be revolving around Gladius Task Force with Marneus Calgar and or Rabute Gilliman. Lots of their useful 5-man utility units, maybe a combi lieutenant, and usually both some range and melee damage dealers, perhaps some gun tanks, maybe Blade Guard with a Judas here. For an army that didn't really seem to be excelling on paper, they got treated surprisingly harshly in my opinion. Nerfs to Big Squad Blade Guard veterans, the Ballistas Dreadnought, Big Squad Jump Pack Intercessors, and Rabute Gilliman himself. And then they got cuts to 2 Land Raider variants, the Gladiator Valiant, Redemptor Dreadnought, and larger squads of aggressors. Ethon Shan also got his new points cost at 85 points. I feel like he's looking rather excellent for that points cost for a fast moving and fighty lone operative. It genuinely seems like Raven Guards do have some big draw to them now, as Kayvan Shrike still remains a very good character. Overall though, in terms of top list power, I probably would put the Space Marines down as slight losers from this one. The Ballistas Dreadnought and 6 strong Blade Guard and Rabute Gilliman were all really quite regularly played in the strongest lists around, so nerfing those is a fairly direct nerf to power, even if Space Marines have loads of units they can fall back on. For the buffs, the Land Raiders dropping is helpful. The Redemptor Dreadnought looks far more in consideration at 195 than 210. I did think it was a bit overcosted at that price. The Valiant still doesn't seem stand out to me, and the Aggressor's Nudge I think is helpful, but they're still going to be a big all-in unit. Maybe there's enough there now, particularly as one of their best ways to get there in Land Raiders drop down. Gilliman still seems good with his buffs. I wonder if we might see a few more Ultramarines lists that just use Calgar and not him though. I genuinely wonder if a few people might pivot to Raven Guard. Having 2 genuinely strong and lone operative style characters seems like a big draw to those guys. Overall feels like a nerf to absolutely optimised lists, but maybe not the worst news in the world to perhaps people playing a bit more of an average mix of Space Marine units. Next up we've got the Astra Militarum. They've been doing okay on the tournament stats previously. Win rates are around 47%, and a fairly respectable 9 tournament victories since the last balance pass, so at least okay performance both for the average player and for people trying to top grand tournaments. The majority of players have either been using Combined Arms Regiment or Hammer of the Emperor, though interestingly enough it's board control lists with Recon element that seem to have been responsible for a good number of those grand tournament victories. Pretty powerful in the hands of a good player to out-victory point the opponent and keep Mass Guard infantry alive in the mid-board, and they can certainly still deal plenty of damage to between special weapons and a few big tanks. For the changes, Gaunt's Ghosts, Lord Solar Leontus, the Krieg Combat Engineers, Small Squads and the Baneblade variants all went down, and for the nerfs it was just the Rogel Dawns that went up, the regular Battle Tank to 250 and the Dawn Commander to 275. Overall between that I feel like they're probably going to be fairly similar. The Dawn tanks were both staples and the Tank Commander the single most likely to be included datasheet in a competitive list. Just going up 10 points isn't going to meaningfully change that on such a big unit. Gaunt's Ghosts were already strong as well though, so them dropping down to 100 points makes them near enough auto-include I'd say. Otherwise Lord Solar Leontus might have a few people looking to him again at 130. The Krieg Combat Engineers could be an alright scouty squad, I still likely guess that the Baneblade variants are going to be overshadowed and have movement issues on competitive boards, but it's quite nice to see a fairly solid points decrease on those guys, and the Lord Solar change helps make them a bit more viable as well. Overall feels like it's not really going to change faction balance too much, perhaps a mild nerf to the Hammer of the Emperor and people spamming Dawn commanders, but if you're using maybe a more typical one or two of them, then it's really not that bad, particularly if also using Gaunt's Ghosts. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain. They're one option to get a board worth of Warhammer 40k terrain on the board. They'll do things a bit differently to most providers out there, basically having a table worth of folding pop-up cardboard terrain. The general idea is that you have 12 tiles laid out on a 3x4 grid. That makes a surface 45 inches by 60 inches, so the right size for a 1000 point or 2000 point Warhammer 40k. Each of those tiles unfolds and up pops a building. So basically the main advantage is that you can have an entire 40k terrain set that can all fold basically flat and fit inside a box set the same size as a standard board game, so it's quite nice if you need to be able to store it in a small space or transport it round to a friend's house or something. I've got a few different designs with different boards available. Obviously there are a few pros, cons and trade-offs versus having flat folding cardboard terrain versus more normal stuff. I'll cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video to talk a bit more about that. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Moving on though, next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus. They were one of the ones that got more big changes in the balance update. Prior to the balance patch, their tournament win rates were a little bit on the low side with 46%. It doesn't really seem like there's been huge amounts of excitement or enthusiasm to put them on the table recently, and I bet players certainly wanted some sort of help for Games Workshop. They've had 3 tournament victories since the last balance pass, not doing great on that front, but still not awful given a low player base. They generally tend to be using Halo Screed or Hunter cohort, and they certainly have a good chunk of their units that seem to be absolute staples and auto-includes, and then a fair few more that are a bit more borderline. What Games Workshop gave them this time around were a few rules changes, 2 of them paying for those with a points bump. The really big and impactful one is to Belisarius' Core. He can basically hand out Admech Oath of Moment style rerolls against one target. That's a pretty massive deal, having a faction commander essentially able to give them the Space Marine core rule just on top of what they already have. And that's certainly going to amp up the danger for an Admech gun line. He did gain other options as well, if that should not be useful in any one turn. I feel like even with the bump up to 175 points, that's a big win for the army overall there. Otherwise, Iron Strider's got twin links but went up 5 points. Again, I'd say that's an improvement. They're far more dangerous for the points cost now. I seem like they're another credible anti-tank choice along with the Scorpius Disintegrator again. And then Ruststalkers had a damage 2 option, and Infiltrators just got a flat damage buff, which seems like all win from that point of view, given they're basically auto-include already. Overall, that certainly seems like a solid boost to the Admech. I expect to see Call in just about every list now, given that reroll ability. And the other changes seem useful, particularly to Infiltrators, and I'm sure we'll see more Iron Striders too. Between all that, I'd expect them to be performing a fair bit better, a few more people coming back to them, maybe more mid to upper mid tier win rate perhaps. This does feel like a pretty meaningful change. Next up we've got the Adeptus Custodes. They had win rates around about 47%, maybe a little bit not doing so great over the past Knights and Death Guard meta. Those guys were just generally doing stat check things better than the Custodes can. They've only had 4 tournament wins since the last balance update, which is pretty low for a popular army, though I feel like that's pretty normal for the Custodes, doing better with the win rates than the tournament victories. They tend to be an army that does well on the mid-tables, or when playing more casually. Typically their top list have been using the Lines of the Emperor, plenty of Blade Champions leading Wardens, but after many balance passes the majority of their units are pretty usable right now. For what they got, Custodian Guard went down, the Land Raider dropped to 220, the regular Shield Captain went to 120, and bigger squads of Prosecutors or Vigilators went down. Overall it feels like it's more of a change to internal balance as opposed to a direct buff to faction strength, though still having a few more viable options doesn't hurt. Custodian Guard were already a very easy auto-include with Inquisitor Draxus. At just 40 points per model, I feel like they might be getting to the point where they're rivaling Wardens plus Blade Champions for more frontline infantry generally. The standard Shield Captain was a little lesser taken than the rest, so it feels like a 10-point drop was appropriate enough for that. Lines of the Emperor is definitely a good detachment for Shield Captains, and I wonder if 10 strong Vigilators or Land Raiders might get some use. They both do feel like they've got some genuine interest. The Land Raider does shoot pretty hard with Ballistic Skill 2+, and could help deliver some cheap Custodian Guard into battle if you wanted. For the Knights of Titan, they've had their Codex recently, though in the first few weeks since their Codex they don't really seem to have been doing all that great. Win rates around about the 46% mark, certainly a bit of a lower debut than plenty faction-specific codexes recently. I think they've just had the 1 Grand Tournament win with the Banishers, though it seems that a few more people are having success with the Warpbane Task Force overall, given the boost to Purifiers that they got. Their balance changes were fairly non-existent. I wasn't really expecting them to change much, given it was quite close to their codex. They just seem to have got the general Land Raider decreases. Overall, I wouldn't expect that to add to faction strength really. They don't generally tend to make good use of Land Raiders given they've got their teleport abilities to move around. Though at the same time I feel like just every so often in the tournament standings some Grey Knight list does manage to make good use of either Razorbacks or Land Raiders. I guess you could use them to deliver some Purifiers into close combat and safety. Be a bit more of a central anvil and assault shunt to go alongside all the fancy teleporting stuff flitting around. I still say they're probably going to be at least fairly similar from a power point of view, which maybe isn't crazy ideal as they do feel maybe a little bit more lower mid than some, and their Terminator units feel overshadowed. Perhaps for wishlist things for future balance updates, scarier Terminators or Purgation squads could be on the list. Next up for the Adepta Sororitas, they've been doing pretty well pre-update. Win rates are around about 52%, one of the factions that seem to be doing best by the numbers in the Knight and Death Guard meta, and seeming like they'd had one of the better performances at top levels of play as well. 7 tournament victories from really quite a small player base, most of those coming from the Hallowed Martyrs detachment, though lots of people were playing with and having good success with Champions of Faith with Paragon Warsuits and Celestian Sacrosants. Given that they seem to be in at least a pretty good position before, I was perhaps a bit surprised they got purely positive buffs. In particular, Games Workshop seems to have made an effort to make the Retributor squad into a scary damage dealer, dropping their points cost down to 105 points, and now changing out their slightly curious special rule, where they now get the +1 to hit and wound as well as their rerolls rather than instead of, which sometimes meant that shooting against a unit that had killed a sister squad was a bit more of a side grade than an actual buff. I feel like that's probably done enough to make them into a genuinely interesting damage dealer squad. At 105 points, if you can use them to counterattack something that's just wiped out a sister's unit, 4 multi-melters are going to have some pretty spectacular threat, though it's still maybe more bringing them up to the level of the other units, I think, as opposed to making them a huge source of faction strength. Otherwise, Celestine and Astrid and Agathe also went down. Celestine was already usable, but I feel like a 10-point cut doesn't really change things too much. I still think Astrid and Agathe are probably going to be niche. Overall, they feel like they're in a good spot though, in a sort of upper mid kind of level, and then getting buffs, not nerfs. Next up, we've got the Imperial Knights. They're a bit of a faction in change at the moment, given that they had their points nerfs a few weeks back. That had pushed them down to more like 53% win rates from the big sort of 60% ones that they had. But then they've also just had their Codex release as well, which is going to change loads of things. People were pretty apprehensive about the possibility of a big nightly rush from Valastrite Lance, potentially moving up and wiping out a bunch of factions that have got kind of low durability, and then having the option to not do that and play a more standard nightly game otherwise. What they got were their official Codex points revealed. It was the same as the recent nerfs, but the Defender went down to 425. They swapped the big knights back to OC10 from OC8, which did seem likely it might have been a typo from Games Workshop, but perhaps the biggest change was the Valastrite Lance basically getting a Day Zero nerf. The crazy stratagems that could affect multiple different knights, particularly maybe with that scary lethal hits one, now only affect one knight, and they can no longer reroll advances, they just get the assault keyword on their guns. Overall, between all that, I'd probably guess that any sort of knight dominant meta has probably been averted. Still though, probably a bit early to say that with the sheer amount of changes they got in their codex. To me, it's felt like Valastrite Lance felt like the standout detachment, so having that hit quite hard Day Zero was certainly a big nerf to how strong the faction was going to be otherwise. I'm going to guess at first impressions they'll probably wind up being strong and still do well in the win rates, but less well at the top tournament results like normal. But I guess they're probably not going to be back to their outright broken state that they were before the big points cuts. For the Imperial Agents, people who try to collect them as an army are still basically waiting and hoping for Games Workshop to treat them like a more standard army, which they don't seem to want to do. They're kind of unplayed at tournaments besides those wanting the challenge to play Warhammer 40k on hard mode. They did get a couple of points drops, so I think that was to mirror the ones for the Deathwatch to keep them the same as opposed to actually to help out these guys. The Deathwatch Big Squad veterans went down to 190 and the Watchmaster to 95. That is still helpful though, given that they're 2 useful units and some of the best damage dealers of the book. Otherwise, they had an errata saying that Draxus and the Standard Inquisitor can no longer attach to Deathwatch kill teams. I kind of wonder if that actually checks out rules as written, given that they still have the ability to attach to Imperium battle line units, which they are. Overall, I guess in theory, that's a small buff to the faction, though I still think in reality it's just being losers by omission. What they need is an actual army rule, and ideally some way to handle big tough tanks and monsters within the book, neither of which they got again, and they're just not really being treated as a standard 40k army. I guess in theory they might be getting some new content with the Deathwatch Veterans rules shortly, and new updated datasheets to reflect their kill team kit, and while that could be interesting for them, it also might not necessarily be a good thing, given that that's a good unit already, and if between points and rules it wound up being less strong, then that could actually hurt the faction as well as help. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Divergent chapter codexes. The Black Templars have been doing rather well in terms of the tournament stats post-codex, sort of feeling like they're in an upper mid-tier sort of level with win rates around 50%, already having a couple of tournament victories, though doing so in a bit of a weird way, usually using Gladius Task Force as it just supports their fighting melee so much better, and the list being focused on a few datasheets, Sword Brethren with support, the Emperor's Champion maybe with some Assault Intercessors, and Repulsor Executioners, which are kind of weirdly good here. Like the Grey Knights, they got no real changes to their codex themselves, though they will be affected by the Space Marine ones. The Blade Guard nerf is unfortunately relevant for them. Those going up 10 points adds a little bit less efficiency to one of their big damage dealer units. They got on quite well with the +1 to wound Templar vows. The cheaper Land Raider variants could be handy enough for them though. If you want to play lore-friendly Black Templars, they're all rather iconic and genuinely aren't the worst for delivering some scary melee threats into close combat, even if you can do so cheaper with an Impulsor, or perhaps opportunistically use a Repulsor Executioner. Overall though, a Blade Guard nerf I don't think is going to affect the faction strength too much. I put them fairly similar. The faction certainly seems to have some internal balance problems though, and perhaps in particular on the wish list I think would be a Templar specific detachment that outcompetes the Gladius. It's just really weird that they decided to release a codex with all 3 of the detachments being quite so heavily keyword restricted. Fingers crossed they rectify things with one of their digital detachments that they release, but also probably put money on Repulsor's Executioner getting nerfed next time. I just can't see the Templar version staying at the 220 points cost when they've got such excess value. Next up, we've got the Dark Angels, tournament win rates around 46%, and not really that many performances at a high event level as well, just the 4 grand tournament victories. Most people are using the Wrath of the Rock with Deathwing Knights and the Lion in them. I think people have been enjoying that one for its raw might, though it does feel like it's a detachment that adds a bit of raw might and makes the Dark Angels into a bit more of a stat check style army, and as a result seems to be doing better at sort of casual or mid-table level, as opposed to more high-level play and winning grand tournaments, at least for the most part. The Unforgiven did get a few buffs though. Lionel Johnson can now use 2 data sheets rather than 1, the Landspeeder Darkshroud dropped down to 100, and the Landspeeder Vengeance went to damage 2 or 3 on its plasma. Like the rest of the Divergent chapters, they'll also be hit by the Space Marine changes, nerfs to Blade Guard and Ballistas Dreadnoughts, buffs to Aggressors, Land Raiders, and Redemptor Dreadnoughts and things. Overall, despite the Space Marine nerfs, I'd still rate them as slight winners for that. The Lion's 2 abilities could genuinely be helpful. You can have both the Mortal Wound Protection and his melee damage buff, or you could use his Forest Walking ability to set him up on a different area of the board, and then use his buffing ability to buff a unit that gets into melee, even if he doesn't make the charge himself. Definitely something extra to a powerful datasheet. The Dark Shrouds feel a bit more tempting, and still not say auto-include at 100 points. They've occasionally seen some play with Storm Ravens in the past. They work well with the aircraft rules and their -1 damage, making them rather hard to kill. It seems like it could be a reasonable enough include just to have hovering alongside some tanky vehicles or infantry though. Otherwise, the Landspeeder Vengeance seems a lot more usable, though I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be standout. It does move fast and has pretty nice general purpose damage output though. If you want to put it in an army list, it feels far less bad. Taken all together though, I'd say they're more small changes, making them just a little bit more efficient, though isn't going to make them into a dominant faction just based on these, I'd guess. Next up, the Blood Angels have been doing okay since the big drops to Sanguinary Guard and some others last time around. Solid upper mid-tier win rates are around 50% or so, 11 tournament victories and doing pretty solidly well there as well. Mostly with Liberator Assault Group, though Angelic Inheritors seems pretty equally powerful, just lesser played. The Space Marine changes might hurt them a tiny bit. Blade Guard were a solid unit for them, and fielding them in 6s was popular. The biggest change happened to Sanguinary Guard though, that went up to 125 points for 3 of them, or 260 per 6, but interestingly enough gained a damage boost, getting a weapon skill 2+ base, and +1 attacks to their spears. Overall, I'd consider that a side grade, and they are fairly similar to before. The Sanguinary Guard obviously hit harder, but at the same time they're pricier, and kind of annoyingly for them it sort of ruined their synergy with Dante a bit. You can still have him lead them, and he still brings some big benefits, but you already had the weapon skill 2+ for them, so a squad of those might just be having roughly the same sort of hitting power, but being pricier than they were before. Kind of cool to see these spears look like an actual consideration now though. Quite nice to get the +1 to wound without having to spend a stratagem to do so. Overall, I still guess the Blood Angels are going to be pretty solidly powerful going forward. For one of the bigger winners of the data slates, there's the Deathwatch. It did seem on paper they needed some help. Tournament win rates are around 45%, just the 2 tournament victories, though admittedly coming from a very small player base, so that's not actually as bad as it sounds. And generally competitive lists were using the Black Spear detachment with Indomitor kill teams, Deathwatch Terminators and Deathwatch Veterans, supported by some good enhancements. It does seem that the Deathwatch were underperforming to the extent where Games Workshop decided to give them a solid boost. Most of their kill teams dropped by 20 points, the Indomitor, Fortis and Spectrus ones. The Talonstrike went down 15. And as we saw with the Imperial Agents, the Watchmaster and Deathwatch Veterans went down 10. They'll also have the Space Marine changes, though I feel like at least for the most part, the Deathwatch weren't leaning very heavily on those as damage dealers. It might depend for any given player exactly what sort of supporting units they were using. Overall, that certainly seems a solid improvement compared with before. The Indomitor kill team was taken and often in multiples in list, and they seem like maybe one of the single biggest winners. The Watchmaster was good and dropped down. The other kill team has also seemed more competitive, which is nice. I wonder if anyone might experiment with Fortis or Spectrus. And for the Deathwatch veterans, I guess we've yet to see what their new datasheet will be. And as with the agents, that could be a big deal for the positive or negative, depending on how useful it is. Overall, seems like pretty good news for them. At least instinctively, I feel like Deathwatch weren't really that far behind, flipping from a little underwhelming to genuinely quite strong. They had very high win rates in the update prior to this. Maybe just weren't excellent for the big 10-man Space Marine squads dealing with all the knights going around. I'd certainly not be too surprised if they started performing rather well again and went sort of upper mid-tier or so. Next up for the Sons of Rust, we've got the Space Wolves. Pre-update, their tournament win rates were 51%, though weirdly enough don't seem to have been doing quite so great as actually topping tournaments, just getting the one tournament victory since their codex released a while back. I do wonder if that's at least partly down to a bit of bad luck there. They've got plenty of top placings, and I feel like they've been doing better than that metric might imply. The most commonly played unique detachment was the Saga of the Beastslayer, often using good numbers of Terminators, Wolfen and Thunderwolf cavalry, plus often some combination of Logan, Ragnar and Ayak, and some people are still enjoying Gladius or Stormlance. It seems that Games Workshop felt that the Space Wolves were deserving of a few nerfs though, which I must admit maybe feels a little bit on the surprising side. In particular, Thunderwolf cavalry are looking far less standout. They went up to 115 for a small squad or 230 for the big one, so no longer having an unusually cheap smaller unit. Otherwise, there's small nerfs to Ayak and Ragnar, both of whom were pretty standout. They still seem solidly strong and playable to me though. Bloodclaws went up to 285 for the 20 strong unit. I feel like that's just Games Workshop not liking horde things as usual. And Logan got a small buff via an FAQ. His High King of Fenris can apply to reserves in general, so deep strikers and things and not just strategic reserves. Sometimes that could be important for unit caps of how much you are putting into strat reserves. Otherwise, they've got the standard Space Marine changes, with things like Blade Guard, Ballistas Dreadnoughts, Aggressors, Land Raiders, and Redemptors moving up or down in points. Overall, it certainly nerfs, and the faction isn't going to be quite as strong as it was before. Thunderwolf Cavalry, Ayak and Ragnar were all really strong, so points increases there is a fairly direct nerf to faction power. I certainly guess that we'll see a few less Thunderwolves and maybe a few more Tyranids and Wolfen to take their places. It does seem like a missed opportunity to buff the Grey Hunters as well. They're really quite clearly underpowered at the moment. For the standard Chaos Marines, pre-update they were looking like a fairly solidly mid-tier army. Win rates around 48%, 6 tournament victories, most of those coming from Renegade Raiders. Pat-bound Zealots also having seemed to have surpassed Creations of Bile as one of the other more popular ways to play the army. Games Workshop just seems to have changed things around a little bit for internal balance. Abaddon dropped down 10, the Land Raider dropped down 20, Venom Crawlers 10, and the Dark Commune went up 10. Fabius Bile also got effectively a small buff, resurrecting at the end of the phase, so it's no longer quite as possible to kill him in one shooting phase now. Overall, unless you are playing Chaos Cult and spamming the accursed cultists, that feels like more of a buff than a nerf. Fabius was already a really good datasheet, so him getting any kind of buff is good news. Some people were using Abaddon as part of a big central damage dealer combo, so I guess that's a small nudge in the right direction for him. Realistically, 10 points on a 270 point model isn't much, and I guess Soulforged Warpack got a small boost, Venom Crawlers being most popular there. Overall, I put them down as very slight winners, but in reality faction strength not really changing from this in any meaningful way. For the Death Guard, they've been running rampant over 40k tournaments since their codex came out, and then they had their emergency nerf a few weeks back. Almost all of their strongest stuff going up by at least fairly meaningful amounts. That did seem to have had the desired effect of making them less standouts. Still one of the stronger armies in the game though. Win rates around about 52% or so post nerfs, and they have still certainly been topping tournaments. 2 event wins in the last 2 weeks, a fair few more high placings, and they still seem overall strong. Pretty much everything that was nerfed still being very playable. Virulent Vectorium still seems to be most played, and Champions of Contagion and the Hammer of Mortarion are still doing well. I was wondering whether or not they were going to do a second pass and hit them with further rules nerfs that just hadn't come out at the points change times, where it looks like Games Workshop have shown restraint here. There were no further nerfs. That seemed to be what a fair few Death Guard players were hoping for, nerf the points but not the rules, as the rules are mainly kind of fun. I think my biggest suspicion was whether or not they were going to break the interaction with Mortarion's Hammer and Deathshroud Terminators, as it is just weirdly helpful for delivering them wherever they want to be on the board, in a detachment that's mainly focusing on the tanks and demon engines. Seems that nothing further has changed though, and as a result it looks like they're going to be shaping up to be one of the strongest factions in the game still. Some other factions around their level certainly got some points nerfs, maybe perhaps the Thousand Sons and the Genestealer Cult in particular. I still guess they're going to be one of the strongest armies in the game, but not pulling away by quite as much as they were prior to the points nerfs. Next up for the World Eaters, pre-updates they have win rates of around 49%. They've been doing pretty well on the tournament victory front. 12 tournament wins, doing really quite well at top levels of play. More with the Berserker Warband after the Khorne Demon King got nerfed. For the World Eaters, it seems to have been a mixed bag. They definitely took some very solid nerfs to some absolute staple units. Spawn went up to 90, Khan the Betrayer to 100, and the Forge Fiend to 170. All of those were pretty much auto-include for the World Eaters, or nearly so, and that's absolutely going to affect the strength of top armies. On the other hand though, they got some very meaningful buffs as well, the biggest one to the 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound. They both dropped down in points by 15 or 20. The Slaughterbound went up to strength 10, and he was already a good leader for scouting 8-bound, and the Exalted 8-bound went from having a pretty underwhelming data sheet rule to a really good one, getting +1 damage versus monsters and vehicles for their weapons. So they went from being sort of middle tier threats to them to absolutely ruinous in terms of damage. 8-bound were already good, Exalted 8-bound were already usable, though a bit less standout than they should be. It was kind of surprising to get a big points cut to the already solid enough one, and then a pretty big points cut and also a massive rules buff to the less standout one, and between those two they add a pretty big amount of faction strength. Otherwise, Angron and Terminators dropped a bit, as did the Land Raider. I feel like Angron needed a bit more than that really, particularly with 8-bound dropping so much to outcompete him for a mainline damage dealer threat, but I guess it's a step in the right direction. Overall, kind of an interesting case for them, seeing as I feel like army lists are going to look quite different. Certainly feels like there's going to be lots more 8-bound in them. Will be interesting to see where they land with nerfs to 3 of their staples, but a really massive and dangerous melee unit getting very meaningfully better. I probably expect them to be slight winners overall, but their supporting units have definitely got worse outside of just sheer rush melee violence. Next up, and perhaps the single hardest hit army in this entire balanced data slate with 1,000 Zons. Pre-update, it did seem like they were one of the factions that seemed most likely to step up and be one of the strongest armies in the game after the Knights and Death Guard nerfs. Win rates were around about 54%, 9 tournament victories to please Tzeentch, so all around really quite strong both at a more average player and higher ends of competitive play, though not really looking anywhere near as bad as pre-nerf Knights or Death Guard were. Generally they were using Grand Coven led by Magnus, lots of Sorcerer and Rubric squads, maybe some Mutalith beasts and plenty of Bow Enlightened. For 1,000 Zons, they did get a few points buffs. The Sekitar robots dropped down to 80, big units of Scarab Cults don't pay an outsized tax, and the Land Raider drops a little. For the Scarab Cult, the Terminator Sorcerer also now gives +1 to hit for his own unit that he marks, as opposed to marking for other things. I guess that's maybe a bit of a side graze, but for directly helping out his own squad, which is well worth buffing, it makes him overall more efficient, both in Grand Coven and in Rubric Phalanx. The +1 to hit enhancement wouldn't be quite so necessary. For the nerfs though, it really was a pretty broad points hike in terms of increases. Almost all of their strong data sheets went up. Magnus, smaller squads of Rubik Marines, Infernal Masters, Sorcerers and Zangor Shamans, both flavours of Zangor Enlightened, the Mutalith Vortex Beast, and the Eldritch Vortex of Ataf, which gives you extra damage in the Grand Coven as a big psychic shooting attack. What feels particularly mean is that it also went hand in hand with Kabbalistic Rituals being nerfed as well. You can now only attempt each of the rituals once, so if you fail one of them, then you can't try again with a different psyker. That will make them less reliable, and certainly feels like a fairly nasty blow compared with all the points rises they gave them. Overall, that feels like there could be a good 100 to 200 points or so on a lot of current competitive lists. I guess in particular big squads of the Bow Enlightened are far less likely to be seen, and most of the rest still seem solidly playable, though not as efficient as they used to be. I still guess that the 1,000 Zons aren't going to be completely underpowered from this. They did come from a position of being perhaps one of the new strongest factions in Warhammer 40k, but still I'd probably guess they're going to be a sort of mid to lower mid kind of level. To me it does feel like a surprisingly harsh nerf. Wouldn't surprise if maybe a couple more squads of Sekitars make it into tournament lists though. 80 points feels a more acceptable price for their premium for infiltrating. Finally for the Deity Legions, we've got the Emperor's Children. Pre-updates they were sort of mid to lower mid tier, 47% win rates and 3 tournament victories. They've been taken down a fair bit since the increases on their Winged Demon Prince and a few other staples last time. They do seem to be fairly mono-build with the Coterie of the Conceited, using Noise Marines, Winged Demon Princes and Infractors as the main damage dealers plus support. For their changes this time around it was mostly positive. Fulgrim dropped down to 340 and can move over 4-inch high terrain pieces without penalty. The Flawless Blades got the other big buff, getting +1 attack to 4 each, and that's a very meaningful increase in their damage output. And otherwise the Land Raider got a bit cheaper, though it isn't exactly the most useful for this faction, given how fast they are anyway. The Keeper of Secrets and Seekers both dropped a bit, and that helped the Carnival of Excess, and the only nerf that they had was to the Lord Cacophonist, going up from 60 to 70, which maybe feels like a bit of an unusual choice. He was used in strong lists, though not usually spammed. Overall though, seems like there's more positive stuff than bad stuff there. The Flawless Blades feel like they're the single biggest winner with that big damage increase. I wouldn't really be too surprised to see a few people choose to take them as damage dealers in their armies, and maybe it could be good news if you wanted to play Peerless Bladesman. Fulgrim definitely moved in the right direction again, though I'd still guess he's probably not going to be standing out strong at that points cost. If you wanted to make use of the Demon Primarch though, he's certainly more efficient, and absolutely easily enough to be good in casual games. I'd rate them as slight winners overall. Next up, we've got the Chaos Knights, doing monstrously well directly after their codex came out, though then they had their points cost come out early, most of the big knights going up a big 30 points or so. Since then, there hasn't really been too much time for new data. Their win rates have been around about the 50% mark or so. There's not exactly been a lot of time since the nerfs happened. It looks like they've won at least one tournament in the week since, overall at least initially looking like they weren't out of the running. Unlike the Death Guard, it seems that Games Workshop did follow on with some follow-up nerfs for the Chaos Knights and rules. These ones probably would have dropped at the same time if it wasn't just a points-only update last time. The changes were to the Lords of Dread Sticky stratagem, which now only works in the command phase. A lot more like regular stratagems of that nature, though of course you get it free there and the 5 OC defense. Abominants can't stack their Warp Storms if they're side by side, so each unit will only have one chance to take mortal wounds from an Abominant, and the Infernal Lance had a nerf to its defensive buff. You can now either get a 6+ Feel No Pain for it, or a 5+ Invulnerable save, but not both, so that's a nerf to the defensive knights in melee in that detachment, or at least ones that didn't already have an invulnerable save, like the Lancer or Atropos. They're all definite nerfs, and at least somewhat meaningful ones. The two strongest attachments toned down a little, but only one aspect of what made them strong, and there's plenty of other good stuff on top of that, and both of the options that were nerfed as well are still very usable. There's also less incentive to spam Abominants, though if you wanted to, you could still just deploy them on different flanks of the map and it wouldn't really matter that much. They're still basically a good datasheet. Overall, they're still looking like slight losers out of the dataslate update, but I feel like none of these changes are absolutely disastrous. I still expect them to be a solidly powerful mid-tier army, and as usual for Knights, probably better at more casual levels versus the top ends of competitive. Finally for Chaos, we've got the Demons. The Servants of the Dark Gods have been doing fairly well in a sort of upper mid-tier status in 40k. 50% win rates and 9 tournament victories, generally doing alright on the top tables. People may be having the most success with Demonic Incursion, though Shadow Legion also doing well, and some people playing the rest such as the Scintillating Change Host and the Plague Legion. Their two more standard detachments often tended to go very big on the greater demons. They had a fairly minimal change data slate, just 2 buffs to Slanesh, the Keeper of Secrets dropping down to 270, and the Legion of Excess getting buffed. He now gets 2 fully reroll hit rolls in the fight phase if you make the Seductive Gambit wherever you are on the board. Previously, the boosted effect was locked to being within the shadow of Chaos. Overall, they feel like slight winners, though maybe more from an internal balance perspective as opposed to gaining direct strength. The Keeper of Secrets buff feels pretty reasonable. They did feel like they were just a step lower than the rest of the Chaos Greater Demons out there. And the Legion of Excess felt like the weakest attachment after the big nerfs that they had. Both of those seem boosts in the right direction, though otherwise for a pure strength perspective the demons feel like more or less where they were. For the Aeldari, I was wondering whether Games Workshop was going to be fairly harsh to them in the balance update, but it seems they've overall done rather well and not really had any major nerfs. Their tournament stats have been doing sort of mid to upper mid, win rates of 51%, but perhaps outperforming that at a top tournament level. No less than 15 tournament victories, which puts them as one of the very highest armies outside the previous big ones on that metric, perhaps implying that they're an army that's absolutely great if you can master it really well, get the most out of all their battle-focused movement tricks, but maybe isn't quite as directly easy to play for the average player, and win rate might be brought down a bit by people trying to make other things work besides the slightly cookie-cutter Aspect Warrior build. Generally, most of the success was coming from people using either Aspect Host or War Host, though both generally supporting Aspect Warriors, Phoenix Lords, and a few other staples. For the points buffs, the Avatar of Cain dropped to 280, Azaman dropped down to 125, Dire Avengers to 75, Wraithblades to 160. The Corsair Void Reavers had their small unit cost go up but the large one go down, and the Swooping Hawks went up to 190, but only for the big squad. Out of those, both the Hawks and the Void Reavers are relevant to some strong army lists, though not literally every army used either Void Reavers or big units of Hawks. Plenty of people went for smaller ones, or just other aspects in general. Otherwise for the buffs, the Azaman one feels pretty relevant. Some people did use him alongside a small squad of Dire Avengers, so if you did, that got 15 points cheaper. I'd guess that neither the Wraithblades nor the Avatar is going to be super standout and common in tournaments, but they both seem solidly usable units if you did want an Anvil squad, and maybe quite good in casual play too. Overall power-wise, they feel kind of similar than before. They've definitely got options to fall back on aside from the Swooping Hawks, and if you wanted small Void Reaver units to play as trading units, you still can for just an extra 5 points each. Or maybe a few more people might choose Rangers or something for minimum investment squads. Overall though, with an army that was winning quite so many tournaments before and seemed to be on the upper end win rates wise, they seem like an army to watch. I guess they might be one of the strongest armies going forward into the new meta. For the Drukhari, they've been played far less. Their tournament win rates are around 50% and have 3 tournament victories over the last balance period, which isn't loads but also not awful given they have quite a small player base. Most people seem to be playing the buffed Reaper's Wager with the flat rerolls it gained last time. Those Sky Splinters also played quite a lot, and overall feels like the faction maybe didn't have loads of excitement, but most units were usable and seemed to be doing alright numbers wise. They got a very minimal change balance pass. The only thing that changed were big units of Kronos dropping down to 85 points, which was a bit of a weird change. While nobody was really using them that way, now 2 Kronos look like they're one of the single tankiest units in Warhammer 40k in general for its points cost right now. I can't help but think that good players with board control things are probably going to be able to find a good way to make use of that. As we know, their new codex is coming out in the not too distant future. It leaked over the weekend. There were some unit losses in that, though also some other options added in. Still feels like Sky Splinter and Reaper's Wager are going to be strong options. Though for being locked to small sections of the codex, both the Cabalites and the Witches look kind of fun. Kind of hard to say whether that's going to be actually strong or not though, as it's going to be very dependent on digitally updated points costs, which we don't have yet. Overall still seems like they're broadly going to be doing okay until then though. For the Tyranids, they hadn't been doing all that well in the stats for really quite a popular faction in 10th edition. Win rates had dropped down to 46%, and they'd only got the 3 big tournament wins since the last update, which really is very low indeed given how widely played they are. The strong detachment for them at the moment have been the Subterranean Assault. That was doing better for the win rates and tournament victories, though Invasion Fleet was still getting lots of play and still broadly doing fine. And for the dataslate update, Games Workshop just gave them a few small scattered buffs. The Neurolictor, Turvagon, Morlock and Genestealers all going down. I don't think any of those are going to completely revolutionise Tyranids or anything. The Neurolictor maybe feels like the single most helpful buff, a already fairly commonly played unit for its battle shock damage buff and lone operative utility. Big Genestealer units are pretty good in Vanguard onslaught, so quite nice for that. I'd guess the Turvagon and Morlock aren't going to be particularly standout. They'll help out for internal balance if you did want to put them on the board. Even if it might not exactly be meta, a Turvagon's really quite an annoying unit to take down with that amount of sheer defense for just 160 points. Overall likely slight winners, but I don't think they're going to be massively stronger. Next up we had the Genestealer Cults. At least by the numbers prior to the update they seem to be doing very very well. Having a better matchup than most against Knights helped them out. Their tournament win rates were incredibly high at 55%, with Host of Ascension in particular at 61, and they got a big 11 grand tournament wins, which is particularly impressive for such a lesser played faction. For all these sort of over-rep style stats on various different stat sites, they seem to be the single faction where if you brought them along to an event or tournament, you had the best chance of making the top tables or winning. That's all with a fairly high skill to play faction though. Generally they've been doing that with Neophyte blocks in the Host of Ascension, buffed by things like Ridge Runners and all their utility units and some melee. And while that might have been standout, the other detachments remained usable. For the balance pass, Games Workshop did give them some pretty solid nerfs, though for a faction that was doing well they maybe got a few more buffs than I might have expected. The Primus does drop down to 70, but he had a replacement of his special rule with a +1 to hit. There's a downgrade overall. Small squads of Atalan Jackals went up. The Achilles Ridge Runner went up to 95 points, which is really quite a meaningful change, as they're in borderline auto-include status. The Host of Ascension had one solid nerf in 5+ critical hits, now costing 2 command points, which is fairly painful. And their return to the Shadow stratagem got a side grade. You can't return units to reserves that get shot, but on the other hand it is a more normal return to reserve stratagem now. So it means that you can go back to redeploying units that were completely safe and maybe drop down to 2 secondaries or something like that. On the other hand though, they definitely had some buffs as well. In particular, the big ones seem to be Metamorphs, which were already a strong unit, and for some reason dropped down to 140 points for 10 of them. They're still going to be very scary in multiple detachments, maybe being led by a Biophagus. The Abominant's down to 85 points. That's good news for Biosantic Brood Surge, as is the Pure Strain Genestealers dropping down to 140 for a big unit. It seems like melee Genestealer Cults got a fairly solid boost. Finally, 3 of the Cult Ambush token related stratagems shifted slightly to be a bit more useful. It felt like they'd been made rather redundant by the way that Games Workshop just rewrote the entire mechanic post-codex. Overall, out of those, I would still guess they're going to be a strong faction. I've put them as slight losers, though I feel like it's borderline between that and being just more solidly toned down. Their best build in Host of Ascension had absolutely taken some heavy hits, but on the other hand it was very strong before. 61% win rate is absolutely no joke. The Ridge Runner nerf is important to most of the detachments. I'd guess more people are going to be using those as a mortar support function as opposed to being used as an option that could do debuffing and anti-tank. And it seems that Biosantic Brood Surge list got a very solid boost in relation to the rest of them. In recent times that one hadn't really been doing all that well by the numbers though. Overall seems like they're nerfed. I still guess they're probably going to be sort of mid to maybe upper mid tier, due to some improvements going alongside the nerfs and just how well they were doing before. Next up, we've got the Leagues of Votann. They've only had a couple of weeks since their codex came out and it started to hit tournaments. They seem to have been broadly doing kind of fine since then. Win rates are around about 51%, no Grand Tournament wins yet, but it's kind of early days for them and they are looking solid enough. It looks like most people are either playing the General Purpose Need Guard Oathband or the Brandfast Oathband Transport one. For the rules changes, this was basically their post-Codex FAQ. One thing they decided to fix was the disembarker unit within 6 for the Brandfast Oathband. I've seen a bit of discussion around the transports arriving from reserve and then jumping out within 6 inches for close charges. You now can't charge after that and you can only do it in your turn. The Halfband had yield points added to some boosted effects for a couple of stratagems, and the core rule shifts slightly to reroll wounds of 1. It doesn't exclude blasts either, which are quite a few Votann weapons. And they also patched the transports being able to hold those Chthonian artillery. Overall, I guess technically that was a slight power nerf due to the Brandfast stratagem being a relevant one, though it did feel to me like there was a pretty good likelihood that they might address that one. Overall, doesn't really seem like it's going to change army power in a huge way, and overall looking like an interesting mid to upper mid tier faction currently. They're kind of early days yet from their codex. They can certainly put out some big damage with some combos. Maybe one of the biggest winners of the data slate were the Orks, though they certainly needed a pretty solid power boost. They had win rates of around about 53%, and for a popular faction, only winning 3 grand tournaments over the entire last balance meta did show that they were particularly struggling, both in terms of an individual player level and at the top of grand tournaments. The majority of people were using Warhorde, though most of the other detachments got some play to a greater or lesser extent. Seems that Games Workshop agreed that they needed some help though, and gave a lot of points decreases, big squads of flashkits and looters, Squigosaur bosses and Mozrog. Warbikers went down, Boss Snickrot dropped to 75, the boss in Mega Armor and Mega Knobs had points cuts, and the Shock Attack Gun went down. Then on top of that, there were some helpful rules changes as well. Gasgul Thraka can join boys or knob squads and takes up far fewer spaces in a battle wagon, so he can actually join them in a transport. The Commandos unit can split in half. The Kill Rig got some buffed sword blades and the monster keyword, and both Death Dreads and the Killer Cans had their datasheet rules improved. The Death Dread one maybe being the winner there with some mortal wound impact hits to add to a little danger. Overall, between all that, it feels like they've got a solid lift on a number of fronts, though most of the changes fell on things that weren't already super strong. Maybe for standout buffs, I feel like the Commandos and Snickrot change are a particularly good one. Commandos can now function in small efficient trading units, whereas having to make a big commitment to an all-or-nothing 10-man squad was a big downside and weakness they had compared with other factions' infiltrators. I feel like they're probably going to be in borderline auto-include territory. Boss Snickrot at 75 is just so much better for a utility Orc clone operative too. He was already played from time to time at 95, and again I feel like he's kind of borderline auto-include at that points cost too. Otherwise, Gasgul and Kill Rigs were both good in their own ways as well. With his datasheet buffs, I could certainly see good argument for putting him with a big unit of boys, or a squad of knobs that can put out far more damage per point compared with the Mega Knobs. Kill Rigs were a solid datasheet and getting extra AP doesn't hurt. Mega Knobs dropping just generally make them far more in contention in general, but is great for bully boys, and both Dread Mob and Tactical Brigade got better, between the looters and flash kits going down to original points, plus the Shock Attack Gun mech, which is good for both of those detachments. The Beast Boss changes were also quite significant points cuts as well, still maybe going from a weak unit to just a bit more usable, but you're now getting to the point of having some fairly hefty stats for the points. Overall feels like the sort of thing that Orcs needed. I certainly expect them to be a far more mid-tier army after this, and no longer vying for the worst faction in the game. Next we've got the Tau Empire. They had tournament win rates of around about 46%, so a bit lower mid there, though they were clearly a faction that with a good player playing an army list well, they could win events, no less than 9 tournament wins. I feel like that often plays into the narrative they often have, a faction that's not necessarily the easiest to command due to somewhat fragile units and needing to balance range damage versus pushing forward, though for people who know the army well, they're able to wield the force of the greater good as a pretty scary army. Lists definitely have a few staples with some of the same damage dealers and support units. It's interesting to see that Kroot are generally looking like they're viable on their own merit though, the Kroot Hunting Pack having won a few grand tournaments. The Krootox Rampagers have got some okay stats in most places, but with some actual support and a great detachment rule, they're kind of next level. Tau certainly did well out of the update though. Commander Farsight, the Farsight Marksman, Broadside Battlesuits and the Fire Knife and Sunforged Crisis Suits all dropping down, and the Riptide also getting a buff from the Ion Accelerator. I feel like the buffs here aren't absolutely enormous, but all helpful and mostly on pretty relevant units already. The Riptide was already seen playing lots of lists, so making him a lot better against toughness 10 vehicles is a big win for that big damage 4 Ion Accelerator. Broadsides were also seeing a lot of play, maybe particularly in Montcar for a sturdy firebase unit, and they've got a serious buff dropping down to 80 points each. Particularly now you can spot for them with just one unit, you could have 3 side by side as a pretty murderous gun line. Farsight and the Crisis Suit squads maybe felt like they were okay balanced for their points cost but not standout. Dropping 10 points I feel like puts them much further into the top tier of the Tau. And overall the changes seem to be pretty great for the Retaliation cadre, basically all of them being battlesuit related. Overall, looks like pretty good news for the Tau. I put them somewhere between slight winners to just outright winners. Certainly seems that if a good number of people were managing to win tournaments with them beforehand, that's certainly not been made any harder, and with the units being buffed, I'd expect that the average player will be doing better with them too. Finally, last but not least, we have the Necrons. They were looking at least fairly well balanced pre-update. Win rates are around 49% and 5 grand tournament victories, sort of middling-ish for the numbers playing them, and generally doing well with the Star Shatter Arsenal and the Awakened dynasty. Their changes were relatively straightforward. The Silent King dropped down 20 points to 400 points, though swapped his Ignores Modifiers buff for a plus 2-inch move one, and Triarch Praetorians dropped down 10 points. They were rather underpowered at 100 points, and now they feel a bit more balanced, fairly capable of bullying some medium infantry. For the Silent King, I'd say it's a side grade to maybe a slight upgrade. The Ignores Modifier debuff was definitely useful against certain armies, perhaps particularly Death Guard, though even then the rerolls buff that you could get was a pretty standout one. The movement buff that's replaced it, I'd say, isn't quite as strong, but it is still usable. If he's not planning on dealing some big damage this turn because there's no enemies exposed, then that could be a nice enough thing to have in the core of your army and get everything moving to where it needs to be turn 1. And when he's ready to actually engage the foe, swap to the rerolls, which have great value both for him personally and everything nearby. Overall though, with a 20 point decrease, I feel like that's overall a win. It was already a good model and well played, and now is cheaper to include, with a small 5% points cut. Overall though, I don't feel like it's going to make any massive waves for the Necrons. It's only 10 or 20 points here or there, though I guess could give a tiny boost to the Obeisance Phalanx. I still expect Necrons to be more or less where they were, maybe a sort of mid to upper mid faction. Overall, as per normal, Games Workshop's balanced data slate is certainly going to shake up a good few armies. I would rate the vast majority of these as fairly positive changes, both for the nerfs and the buffs. Even with that though, there's still maybe a few disappointing changes. I feel like Thousand Suns were maybe hit a bit harshly compared with what they needed to be. The Space Wolves seemed a touch harsh. I kind of wonder if they perhaps should have gone a little bit harsher on Death Guard and Aeldari. For factions that are looking strong after the changes, I certainly expect the Death Guard and Aeldari to be doing rather well. They both still seem to be really quite strong after the last changes, and didn't get any worse here when they had some of their rivals nerfed like Thousand Suns and Genestealer Cults. Otherwise feels like there's plenty of factions vying for the sort of upper mid tier kind of level and maybe rivaling them for the crown. Black Templars, Imperial Knights, Sisters of Battle, the Blood Angels, Chaos Demons, World Eaters, maybe Leagues of Votann. Will be interesting to see if some of the buffed armies rise up in a really meaningful way as well. Deathwatch and Mechan Orks all got a really solid lift. They were coming from a place where they weren't quite so exciting before. For armies maybe looking a little bit weaker, or some perhaps disappointment, as mentioned the Thousand Suns and Genestealer Cults and Space Wolves all caught meaningful nerfs. The Imperial Agents again losing due to lack of interest from Games Workshop, and the Grey Knights seem like they're going to be one of the weaker factions in the game still, seeming like they were struggling with a few of the other struggling armies getting buffs. I'll certainly be interested to see how things shake out though, when people start to play these guys in tournaments a bit, and we get some data as to what does well or not. I'll certainly be interested to hear your takes though. What do you reckon is going to be doing better or worse after the changes? That's it for this one though. I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titans Terrain before I go, and talk a little bit more about their pop-up 40k terrain system. As mentioned earlier, it's a bit different to other 40k terrain, and I'd say it does have a few more clear advantages and disadvantages compared with most. The main unique selling point is that it's really quite easy to store on transport due to all being able to fold flat, which basically none of the other terrain systems can do, or at least not quite so easily. Quite good for if space is limited at home or if you need to transport it to a friend's house. It is far cheaper than Games Workshop's terrain, though you could say that of most terrain out there, it's at least somewhat comparable with an MDF style board. And for people who don't have loads of time as well, you don't need any painting or assembly, it's just ready to go straight out of the box pretty much immediately, even more so than the kits that you need to slot together. It does come with some trade-offs though. It's certainly less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF given it's made of cardboard. It is designed to fold flat, so you might need to take a bit more care of it, and for the buildings you usually can't put miniatures in the top floors and things as they don't bear loads of weight. The grid layout can lead to a bit less flexibility than some as well, but it does have a few options with rotating them or adding in some further terrain on top of the tiles if desired, which might not be the worst idea to break up a few firing lanes. It doesn't really make tournament-approved layouts, though I've had good anecdotes about it being reasonable enough for casual games of 40k. For their different sets, they have a few different designs, a Forgotten Furnace one which is all glowing chaos runes and foundries and factories and things. And then they've got a Shattered Hive Ruined City style one, bombed out buildings and armoured containers, fairly typical 40k style terrain there. Each of those also has an expansion and centerpiece kit, these made from pushing 2 tiles together. There's a cathedral style thing for the city, and then a great big infernal spire for the factory. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave that there for now though. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, feel free to subscribe. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. And if you'd like to support the content on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.